Let's begin. I really enjoyed reading your book, and I have this saying with my husband that everything I ever learned, I learned from musical theater because I'm a musical theater kid.
I can relate to that.
So when I was reading the very beginning of your book, it says basically that it was with a conversation with your brother about the musical Six,
Right.
which is about Henry VIII's six wives, that sort of sparked the beginning of writing this book. So what was it about that experience that made you want to write this book? And just start with that question.
Yeah, so I have a soapbox that I like to get up on as regularly as possible whenever given the opportunity. And because I'm a priest in the Anglican Church, I do sometimes have this opportunity, which is, as Anglicans, we have a little bit of a sheepish origin story. Like we kind of say that the Anglican Church was created because King Henry VIII wanted a divorce. And what I like to say instead is actually the Anglican Church was created because the woman that King Henry VIII wanted to marry was a reformer. So anyway, it was Christmas vacation, and my brother was asking me about having gone to see the musical Six. And I was just gearing up to get on this soapbox because I had a lot of opinions about how Anne Boleyn was portrayed in the musical Six. She is portrayed as ditzy, as, fairly promiscuous, and there's just a little bit of light victim blaming that, she kind of aspired to heights that were too high and didn't think things through properly, and then when Henry killed her, she kind of deserved it. Was the subtext of how she's portrayed. Now, I have gone on to listen to various commentaries by the creators of Six. They were doing that portrayal with a wink and a nod, not really believing those things about Anne Boleyn, but unfortunately it leans into so many of the negative portrayals that have followed her around over the past 500 years that I'm not sure the irony would have been absorbed by all of the audience.
Got it.
So I was kind of saying I was so annoyed by Anne Boleyn, and I hopped up onto that soapbox and gave my line about the Anglican Church. And my brother grew up Anglican, as did I. He was really not interested in the church or Anglicanism. My mom sometimes had to pay him to go to church.
Oh my. Yeah.
And he's also my brother. I don't get a free pass with any of my opinions.
Right.
He is not just naturally interested in what I have to say. So when I started to talk about all of this with Anne Boleyn, and he was genuinely interested, and not just interested, but he said to me, I have literally never heard any of that before. Where is that book? I want to read that book.
Wow.
And at that point, I thought, okay, so my accountant brother, who's not interested in the church or my ideas, is interested in re-examining who Anne Boleyn was and why she matters. I wonder whether there's a book there.
Fantastic. So there are lots of books on Anne Boleyn.
There are lots of books.
Lots of books on Anne Boleyn. So what makes this one different from those?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked that question, and I'm pretty quick to articulate what makes it different, because the thing is that, there are a lot of books about Anne Boleyn, and they're written by historians, which I am not. I am not a historian. I did a lot of research for this book, but I didn't go back to original Latin texts and, go through first
edition
kind of things, like trying to find something
primary
sources, that's the word, that nobody had seen before, this different angle. I realized very quickly, as soon as that seed was planted, maybe I should write this book. I realized that book has been written.
Okay.
Historians have long been very clear about Anne Boleyn's influence and impact on the English Reformation. But that isn't the popular narrative that is told about her. That isn't what the average person who knows who Anne Boleyn was thinks that she was about. And even in our Anglican pews, our Anglican churches, people don't know that history of how she influenced the English Reformation. So I wanted to approach her life and this conversation not just as, representing the history in a way that's a little more accessible than reading a 700-page tome that goes through every single detail of every single source and excavating all of the minutiae of Anne Boleyn's life, which you can read a lot of those books, and I find them fascinating, but not everybody wants to read that book. So I did want to present the history in an accessible way, but I also wanted to engage the history as a text, as a conversation, kind of like we do as priests when we're preaching a sermon. We go back to these ancient stories from long ago and we have a conversation with what these stories have to say for us today. So I approached her story as that conversation. What does her story have to say to me? Why is this important to me as a woman in leadership in the church that she had a hand in shaping?
Yeah.
But also, why is this important to us?
Yeah.
Why should we care? Why should we care about a woman from 500 years ago
Right.
for our lives today?
That we might have learned about in history class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, actually, could you just give us a brief outline of Anne Boleyn's life, her history, so that we're all on the same page here for the people who maybe weren't paying attention in history class?
This is the hardest question of the evening.
I'm
because
sure.
It is a pretty
How do you
complex
synopsize
history, but I'm going to try to be succinct. Okay, so Anne Boleyn was born around the turn of the 16th century, so probably about 1501. She was born to a noble family. She spent her formative teenage years mostly in the court of Queen Claude of France. So she grew up in France. She was extremely well educated. And in her time in France, she was living on the European continent at a time of cataclysmic change and of new ideas bubbling up all across the continent, which had a lot to do with the printing press. So the printing press had been invented the century before, but entrepreneurs were starting to get a sense that there was money to be made.
They could use it
to print materials that people wanted to read. And what people most wanted to read was the Bible. The Bible as a bestseller started in the 16th century. People wanted to read the Bible and they wanted to read it in their own language because prior to that they did not have access to the Bible in their own language. So she was in this hotbed of really strong, intelligent, well-educated women who were all really engaged in these very hot topics about the Bible, about accessing the Bible, and about how that was shifting people's sense of religious authority, who should be in charge, who should have access to these ideas, and how people should work out their salvation. So she was in the midst of all of these really interesting conversations, and women were right in the thick of these conversations. She went back to England, likely to secure a good marriage. And a number of years after she returned to England, King Henry VIII noticed her. And at that point, he had been married to his first wife for about 20 years, Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess. And they only had one child, and it was a girl. So that was a political problem, it was a personal problem, but for Henry, it was a religious problem because he interpreted their lack of offspring, especially male offspring, as being God's judgment on their marriage. Catherine had been his brother's widow, and there is one verse in Leviticus that forbids the marrying of your brother's widow. And I'm not sure actually whether it's your brother's widow or your brother's wife, but anyway, he thought the proof was in the procreational pudding. Don't have a son, so God is mad. So he decided that he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn instead. The conversation started as being one of convincing the Pope to grant this annulment to Catherine. But Anne was reading a lot of reform materials, contraband reform materials, things written by people who weren't supposed to be writing these things in England at the time, some of whom were living in exile because they were writing things that very recently King Henry VIII had vehemently disagreed with. But Anne was able to pass along some material to Henry that shifted the conversation from trying to convince the Pope to questioning the authority of the Pope entirely. Wow. And that led to a 6-year process of Henry and Anne working together to get all of the pieces in place and the theologians and church leaders in place to split the church from the authority of the Pope. 6 years after all of that adventure started, they did get married. Henry declared himself the head of the Church of England, so he granted himself the annulment and put himself in charge. A few months later, Elizabeth was born. Elizabeth would go on to become Queen Elizabeth I. And then 3 years later, after kind of literally moving heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn, she was brought up on charges of adultery, incest, and high treason, and she was put to death on May the 19th, 1536. Wow.
So that anniversary is coming up.
It's coming up.
Interesting. Interesting. That's such a turn.
Such a turn. Yeah. It's a very dramatic story.
Yeah. It's definitely eye-popping for sure. So is it? Do you think it's the drama of the story that has attracted people to her so much over the years? I mean, again, the musical Six. There's 6 wives in this story, and she's the second. What is it about Anne Boleyn that you think? Like, is it that she was the one that helped to create all this change, and to what end, and so quickly?
Yeah, I think that there are layers to how I would answer that. I mean, I think first you can simply say it does present as a sort of soap opera.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
And has,
yeah. I don't know how many of you have seen the serial drama, The Tudors, but that is a good way of telling this story, not in a 5-minute synopsis, but like over 2 seasons and 20 episodes as you kind of unpack the drama of this story. It lends itself well to that. I think that if you go like a layer down, it's hard not to be left with questions when you hear this story. Questions about, well, what was it that was so captivating to Henry about her? Why did he go to such lengths to make her his wife? And then what happened to turn him so completely against her? So, I remember as a child being introduced to Anne Boleyn's story through the movie Anne of the Thousand Days, which is a pretty signature portrayal of Anne Boleyn. And I was quite literally haunted by her ever since, you know, by the sense of, okay, well, like, as great as that movie is and that portrayal is, it just left me with so many questions of like, but why? And what is it? What was it about her rise and then her fall? And then I think, you know, the other piece that I would say about that captivation, that sense that 500 years later, here we are still talking about her as if she might have something relevant to say to us. You know, any of the portrayals of her, no matter how skewed they might be, maybe with the exception of 6, like, you get the sense that this was a strong-willed, intelligent woman who didn't necessarily just conform to expectations, whose life kind of drew outside the lines in some really interesting ways. And so I think there has been this ongoing sense that you know, maybe we need to look again. Maybe there are some things that we've missed. Maybe there have been some ways that she has been dismissed or demeaned that need to be re-examined.
Yeah, that's very popular in popular culture right now, is to look at the characters. I guess we're doing it more historically as well, but I'm thinking of things, again, musical theater, my forgive me, like Wicked, like where it's like, oh, we're gonna take and flip the script a little bit, and take a look and say, maybe the wicked witch isn't wicked, and maybe the good witch wasn't good, right?
Exactly.
And so I can see why we would. Well, and I've got this question directly from your book. I found a couple of great questions in there in your introduction, where you say, in what ways have we tried to get Anne Boleyn to conform to the usual tropes we use for problematic women? I find that really interesting. So that's a way of saying, wait a second, how have we seen her over time that it's been a convenient way for us to explain this really challenging story?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say to that at this point? How do you think we've tried to have her conform to these tropes for problematic women?
Well, I mean, you look at the labels that have most often been applied to her over the past 500 years, and they are labels that suggest that she was sexually problematic or promiscuous. So she was often and has often been called a whore, a seductress, a manipulator, a gold digger, a social climber. So, you know, those are labels that get applied to strong-willed women pretty routinely. Not during her lifetime, but it didn't take that long after she lived and died that the label of witch started to be applied to her, that there were suggestions that, you know, maybe what had captivated Henry was that she bewitched him, that she was dealing in nefarious, you know, dark dealings. So interesting how that label came to eventually be attached to her. We haven't been that creative in how we have torn down women that don't conform.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, in fact, I think what's really interesting is the first thing you mentioned was her sexuality, right? Like, that's a typical way to attack women. You actually have a whole chapter in your book called The Matter of Sex. Like, we've just got to put it on the table, right? So what do you think Anne's story is telling us about culture and female sexuality, maybe then, but most particularly today? Like, where do you see that whole, because it's interesting, you said, well, boom, 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 she's, you know, promiscuous, all this. And then you said later people thought of this. So clearly this has been, this concept of her being promiscuous and using her sexuality in an inappropriate way has been around a long time. Right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so I will say, first off, and this I think is a really important point. So she was accused and regularly labeled as a whore and a concubine and a prostitute in her life. That was actually a way of talking about her religious beliefs. And, you know, you don't have to look too far back in the Bible to see that there is a long-standing tradition of equating what is judged as religious faithlessness with the label of a whore.
Right. It was applied generally to the nation of Israel, right? The people of Israel. If God is the husband and Israel is the wife, then faithlessness was considered. Yeah. Promiscuity. Yeah.
So she did hold Reform beliefs. That was extremely polarizing. There were a lot of people who agreed with her beliefs and were willing to support her, but of course there were just as many, probably more, who were vehemently opposed to her religious principles and the way that she was leading the church. So a lot of that sexual labeling during her lifetime had to do with being judged as religiously faithless.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But other culture, but down the years, I'm sure that people casually looking at that just take it on face value.
Well, yeah, that has ended up on the cutting room floor. The whole religious argument that she was very much involved in, that kind of goes by the wayside, and you're just left with the labels.
Right.
Historians, most historians agree that probably she had one sexual partner in her entire life, and that was the king. Which, again, stands in marked opposition to how she has been portrayed in popular culture. And, you know, it's very interesting researching Anne Boleyn, and when people find out that I am writing about her or interested in her, the things that people will tell me with just such utter conviction about Anne Boleyn.
That they know. This is what I know about Anne Boleyn.
This is what I know. And very often, the things that people tell me they know about Anne Boleyn is that she fooled around, that she was, you know, had a lot of lovers. And they will also tell me that she set herself out to land the king. She tried to get herself in the king's vision, and then she manipulated him into wanting to marry her. And I find both of those accusations are the evidence which suggest false, but they're interesting that those have been the cultural takeaways that have been applied to this woman who was a really good politician, was extremely well educated, had very strong religious convictions, and you know, got involved in a lot of the business of the kingdom that people wished she would leave alone. And you know, those have been the stories that have been told about her.
Interesting. And it is, and also too, right, because not just the what she was called during her lifetime, but also like what she died for, right? You said it was adultery, incest, and last one was treason, right? Like it was the sexual crimes and right?
Well, and you know, it became easy for Henry to believe that because she had disappointed him in other ways, i.e., she didn't have any more sons than her predecessor had, which left him worried that maybe she didn't fix his relationship with God after all. And she was kind of meddling in the business of the kingdom in ways that he found inconvenient as well. And I mean, there are a lot of complex reasons why he turned against her, but those are two of the reasons. It became easy for him to believe then that she was also being unfaithful to him sexually.
It's just easy to put that in
Yeah,
the
just
hopper.
throw
right?
it into the mix. It all kind of mix it up. It all makes sense, I guess, in a way.
And so we haven't seemed to come very far from that these days, right? With some women leaders, right? You've just got me thinking, right? I'm an American, so I've been watching the United States fail and fail again when it comes to women who are choosing the highest role in the land, and often similar kinds of accusations are made against them.
While I was writing this book, I was out for breakfast with a parishioner who, again, told me with complete authority that, of course, Kamala Harris slept her way to the top.
Right.
So yeah, and I mean, it goes back further from Anne Boleyn as well. What has Mary Magdalene been known for? She is being labeled as a prostitute. There is no scriptural
evidence.
basis for that being who she was.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that sex workers deserve dignity and don't deserve to be maligned, but there's no scriptural evidence that she was a prostitute.
Yeah.
And yet she was also a woman who led in unusual ways and was possibly a bit inconvenient. And that's the label that she got slapped with.
Yeah. So all the more important that we go back and look at these stories and say, no, what was the truth? I mean, did you do that with people who come to you now? When somebody says to you with complete conviction, oh yeah, this is what I know about her. How do you respond?
Yeah, I mean, I try.
Do you get out the soapbox?
I have multiple soapboxes now. I'm just always carrying around those soapboxes. Yeah, no, I really try. It's hard to change people's minds.
Yeah.
You know, that's why you have to write a whole book.
Well, if that label primarily was about her faith, tell us a bit more about her faith. Tell us about her faith. Why was it important? What was it about her faith? Was it just that it was reformed, or is there more that you learned about her?
Yeah, so I think that there would be a couple of categories that I would apply to the faith of Anne Boleyn. And again, this has a lot to do with the women who formed her in her time in France.
Okay.
So, you know, we don't have really much that she actually wrote, you know?
Right.
So we don't have a lot of access to the inner workings of her mind. We are always playing guesswork in putting together her inner life.
Yeah.
But I think that we can look at her influences, who she looked up to, and we can look at her actions, and we can piece together what was most important to her as a reformer. And her reform agenda was very different than, say, Martin Luther, who gets a lot of the credit for being the main guy of the Reformation. You know, like, that's fair, but but there were others as well. So I would say, first of all, she was an evangelical. So in those days, that term evangelical specifically meant that there was a desire to get access to and then form the church around the gospel, the teachings of Scripture. So accessing the Bible, having access to the Bible in the vernacular, in your own language, that was core to the evangelical agenda. And that was really important to Anne, access to the Bible in English. And then that becomes the authority by which you structure your beliefs and the life of the church. So that's the first thing I would say about her. The second thing I would say about her is I think it would be fair to call her a reforming Catholic. So we don't see any sort of baby out with the bathwater kind of desire to get rid of the sacraments, to like reformers who followed her, especially the Edward VI, the son of Jane Seymour, and even to a large extent her daughter Elizabeth, although Elizabeth was pretty quirky about her reform, delightfully so, who had a much more strident version of reform, get rid of the sacraments, no real presence of Christ, transubstantiation, saints, like
Very
all of those,
iconoclastic.
Yeah, very iconoclastic. That doesn't seem to have been Anne Boleyn's agenda at all. Maybe if she had lived longer, she might have eventually gone in that direction. But she seemed really interested, along with the women who were kind of part of that circle of formation. She seemed really interested in cleaning up corruption in the church. And there seems to have been a social agenda attached to her version of reform, that if you're cleaning up the church and if you're following Jesus, then that is going to have bearing on how poverty is addressed, and how people have access to education, because again, like, having access to education is synonymous with having access to the Bible,
Right.
and being able
Yeah,
to
if you
read
can't
the
read,
Bible.
you can't read your Bible.
So
Yeah.
a real passion for education, a passion for addressing poverty, and a passion for being able to access the Bible in English.
Wow, that's a really rich picture of a way of having faith in that time period.
Yeah, it seems like the women in that circle were very practical reformers.
Yeah.
They didn't seem to be, they were interested in a personal relationship with God. They were interested in the teachings of Jesus, but they didn't seem to be agitating about, matters of doctrine to the same degree. They seemed concerned with, let's make things better for people.
Right. Let's see how the actual outworking of this makes a difference for everybody. Do you think that's a particularly, because you said it was her circle, it was mostly women. Do you think it was something about their gender that led to that kind of practical reform, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I would just be speculating to say that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Certainly the court of Queen Claude of France, there were a number of strong women who were associated with that court, and it was very education forward for young women. So that's the main place of influence that she had when she was a teenager. I don't know whether there was just kind of a more like, let's put some things into action and not get so wound up about
Right.
grace or works or whatever. Like, let's just do some things.
Let's do some things and let's make some changes and
Let's
see
make
how
some
they
yeah.
stick. So one of the things that you say in your book is that she just wasn't the catalyst of the English Reformation, but an actual architect. So you said that was her faith. Is that what you're saying? Is that it's that aspect of her faith that made her an architect, or is there more?
Yeah, there's more. So you can look at the 6 years that she spent working with Henry, and she really did, you can see in a number of ways over those 6 years between Henry deciding he wants to marry her and the actual wedding and the split from Rome, you can see that she is the driving force of keeping his feet to the fire in going ahead with the split from Rome. You can see her over those 6 years passing along contraband reading material to him and getting him to read it, not just about whether the Pope should really be in charge, but also around redistribution of wealth as you address the corruption in the church. She's passing this stuff along to him over these 6 years. She's making sure that he sticks with the agenda. She is the one who is who's campaigning for reformers who are in exile to be able to come back to England, making safe passage for them.
Wow.
She does a lot over those 6 years. The 6 years plus the 3 years that she's actually Queen of England, you can see really alongside all of those, like that just constant energy applied to the project, you can see two major outcomes of those almost decade, that I think has led historians to call her an architect of the Reformation, because these two pieces that she was ultimately able to help shape made sure that reform was here to stay, even after she died.
Wow.
And when she died, you know, the Catholics thought that they had won the day.
Right.
Like they thought,
Wow.
we're going back to Rome. But first of all, the year before she died, there was finally a published English Bible. And so you look at the start of those 9 years, English Bibles were being burned, and people who published them were living in exile. And 9 years later, there's not only an English Bible published, but it's dedicated to the King and to Queen Anne.
Wow.
So she was a big part of moving that dial on access to the Bible in English, normalizing that idea with Henry. The second thing that has led people to call her an architect is that she was so astute about personnel. So she was making strategic appointments all across the church, all across those 9 years. She had an eye for talent. She was in constant conversation, I think especially with Cambridge and Oxford, around, you know, up-and-comers with a reform bent. And she got them into the highest offices of the church, including Cranmer, who would go on to write the Book of Common Prayer, and Matthew Parker, who was her personal chaplain. And those are two of the three men who are credited with developing a distinct Anglican ethos.
Wow.
Two of those three were Anne Boleyn protégés and appointments. She sought them out. She put them into power. When Cranmer was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury and went to thank Henry VIII for this astronomical appointment, he said, "You have Anne to thank." She was the one who identified him and moved him into a position of power. And then all of these men who became bishops and archbishops of the church, they were the ones who continued the reform agenda. Cranmer was hugely responsible for the education of Edward VI and probably Elizabeth I as well. They were raised as Protestants because people were in positions of power that made sure that reform agenda continued into the next generation.
That is a lot of influence.
It's a lot of influence.
That's a lot of influence.
And I mean, we're still using the Book of Common Prayer all across the globe today. That was an Anne Boleyn protege.
Wow. That's very different from the story of just like that. There's so much missing in the stories if you just look at her life as you said, as a soap opera.
Yeah.
Or like you take a point in your book to look at fairy tale archetypes even, because it's got that kind of the story has turned into that. It's got sort of Cinderella elements to it, right? She's plucked from this and raised this, and then, you know. So as people are looking at her story now with this kind of information, what is it that you hope we really know about her? What is it that you want us to come away with, like, to know about this woman, and what difference does it make, rather than just thinking, she lived a long time ago? Like,
yeah, I think there's a couple of aspects to that. I think she is just a fascinating person who had a very dramatic story, and so she gives us an opportunity to just really enjoy like the complexities of who she was and how she did and didn't meet expectations, how she did and didn't conform. There are a lot of stories about her that suggest she could be pretty hot-tempered and sometimes not very nice. And and I think that just the delight in being able to have a fully realized female figure in our history to really engage with. She wasn't a saint. She wasn't a sinner. She doesn't subscribe to the easy categorizations. She was a person and a really interesting person. So I find that very inspirational as a woman to be able to have this fully realized, female story.
Yeah.
So I think there's that piece that's specifically about Anne, but then I really want, more generally, for there to be an understanding that the idea that history was made just by the white guys is fiction.
Yeah.
I want there to be an understanding that that there were so many different kinds of people who didn't get into the history books, or who got into the history books in distorted ways.
Yeah.
Who were actually movers and shakers and have their fingerprints smudged all across the institution of the church and the world that we live in today. I think that is really important. I think that having a filled out sense of our history, of because for every woman like Anne Boleyn who pops off the pages of history, even in a distorted way, there were so many other women behind the scenes whose names we don't know, who were also involved in these cataclysmic conversations and who had opinions about reform and the church and salvation and relationship with God, and they had ways of getting their influence into the mix as well, even if they haven't been the ones who get the credit.
Oh, that's really beautiful. I think that's, for me, that's personally inspiring, right? This idea that all of us can contribute in that way, and that we don't necessarily get the glory, but doesn't mean that we haven't had the influence.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And almost all of us aren't going to make it onto the pages of the history books, and that's fine. But if we can also have those history books a little bit more representational of the diversity of people involved, then I think I think it matters in pretty consequential ways. I think it's more than just an interesting intellectual exercise. I think that when people's stories don't get told, it's easier to dismiss them, diminish them. It's easier to turn a blind eye to violence and injustice.
Yeah, and representation is so important also for people to feel seen just themselves too, right? That somehow I can place myself in the story.
Exactly. I mean, with Anne Boleyn, I think that at the end of the day, as captivating as she was, as unique and dramatic as her story was, she was also a woman of her time.
Right.
And she was formed to be a strong woman and a strong leader because she saw other women leading and influencing and acting in ways that normalized that for her. She grew up with it being a fairly normal idea that she should be educated and that women can lead. And So I don't think that she necessarily saw herself as an outlier. I think she saw herself as part of a team. And how important is that for women in leadership today?
Yes.
To understand that what we're doing, even if there are glass ceilings that need to be broken, or there are like first appointments of a woman to be in the Archbishop of Canterbury, for example.
Yeah.
As exciting as that is, as important as those milestones are, it's also not new. Women have always been leading.
Yeah.
Women have always had an impact, have always had things to say. It's not like we just woke up 50 years ago and said, I think we could probably contribute something to the leadership of the church now. No, women have always been part of the leadership of the church.
That's right.
They just haven't been given the titles and the positions of power.
That's right. That's great. Is there anything else that you hope specifically church audiences would take away from this talk, from your book?
I think you should all get a soapbox. And when you ever hear somebody say, our church was started because King Henry VIII wanted a divorce, you can get that little soapbox out and you can say, actually, our church was created because, among many reasons, the woman that Henry was interested in was a reformer. I would love for people, especially in our Anglican congregations, to feel some ownership of how influential women like Anne and others have been informing our church as well.
That's really a great place to land on this, I think, because I think you're right. It answers that little, well, what makes Anglicanism different than? I get this question a lot when we have art crawl and folks. And how did it start? I think there is always this little well, it didn't start great. And so thank you. What a gift to give us no, we can say very proudly that actually we can say it started with a woman, but not it started with a woman who caused all this trouble in this way. It's a woman who caused all this good trouble, right?
Yeah.
To quote John Lewis, she caused good trouble.
Caused good trouble.
Yeah.